Most people don't know that one of the most powerful Nazis in Germany had a brother who actively worked against the regime. But the reason he survived isn't what you've been told. The truth is way more complicated and way darker than the propaganda suggests. When you hear about people who saved Jews during the Holocaust, you probably think of Schindler's List or Raoul Wallenberg. Those are the famous stories. Those are the names everyone knows. But there's another story that almost nobody knows. A story about a Nazi officer, a man in uniform, a member of the party, who spent years secretly saving Jewish lives, not despite being a Nazi, but within the system itself, working from inside the machine to fight the machine. So who was he? Why did he do it? And how did he survive when so many resistors were executed? Let's talk about the truth that both sides tried to hide. His name was Albert Goering. And yes, he was the brother of Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. That's important because it means Albert had access that no other person could have had. He had family connections to the regime. He had a name that opened doors. He had privilege and power that could protect him, and he used all of it to save people. Hermann Goering was the head of the Luftwaffe. He was Hitler's right hand. He was one of the most feared men in the entire Nazi regime. He controlled the Air Force. He controlled vast amounts of resources. He had the power to execute people or save them with a single word. He was untouchable. And his younger brother Albert was completely different from him. Albert was born in 1905. Hermann was born in 1893. They had a 12-year age gap. By the time Albert was growing up, Hermann was already becoming a pilot, already becoming involved in politics. Hermann was heading down one path while Albert went a completely different direction. Albert became an actor. He worked in theatre. He worked in film. He was an artist and a performer. He was sensitive and thoughtful. He was everything his brother wasn't. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Albert didn't join the party enthusiastically like his brother did. Hermann threw himself into the Nazi movement. He believed in it. He became a true believer. He rose through the ranks. But Albert didn't. He didn't have that fanaticism. He didn't have that ideological commitment. But he also couldn't refuse to join. You didn't refuse membership in Nazi Germany. If you refused, you were suspicious. You were unreliable. You were dangerous to the state. So Albert joined. But he did it reluctantly. He did it while actively opposing what the Nazis were doing. This is where Albert's story gets interesting. Because he joined the Nazi party and he worked as an official in the regime. But he used his position to do the exact opposite of what the Nazis wanted. He used his access to save people. He used his family name to protect people. He used his position within the bureaucracy to create paperwork that would get people out of Germany alive. By the late 1930s, the Nazis had started implementing their policies against Jewish people. First, it was discrimination. Jewish people couldn't work certain jobs. They couldn't go to certain places. They were marked, identified, separated. Then it escalated to legal persecution. They lost their property. They lost their businesses. They lost their rights as citizens. Then it escalated further to forced deportation. They were told to leave. They were forced out of their homes. And Albert watched it happen. He saw it. He understood what was coming, and he decided he couldn't accept it. He couldn't just stand by and let it happen. The first thing Albert did was simple. He started handing out visas. That doesn't sound like much when you say it quickly, but visas were literally the difference between life and death. A visa meant you could leave Germany. It meant you could escape. It meant you could survive. Without a visa, you were stuck. You were trapped. If you were trapped, the Nazis would eventually come for you. And if they came for you, you probably wouldn't survive. Albert had authority to issue some travel documents through his work. It wasn't his primary job. It wasn't why he was in his position. But he had access to the bureaucracy. He understood how the system worked, and he used it. He started issuing visas to Jewish families. He would tell them, "Here's your paperwork. Go. Get out. Leave now. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Just go." But that was just the beginning. Albert did something even more dangerous. He started directly confronting Nazi officers, not just silently disagreeing with them, not just looking the other way when bad things happened, actually confronting them, telling them they were wrong, telling them that what they were doing was immoral, telling them that they should stop. There's a documented case where a Nazi officer was publicly humiliating a Jewish woman in front of other people. The officer was mocking her, degrading her, abusing her verbally while other Nazis watched and laughed. And Albert saw it. He was there. He witnessed it. And he walked over. And he told the officer to stop. He told him it was wrong. He told him that she was a human being and deserved to be treated with respect. He did this in front of other Nazis, in front of witnesses. This was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. A junior officer confronting a senior officer about how they treated a Jewish person. In Nazi Germany, you could be executed for less. You could be sent to a concentration camp for less. You could disappear for less, but Albert did it anyway. He risked everything. Why didn't the Nazis execute him? Why didn't they arrest him? Why didn't they send him to a concentration camp? Why did he survive when so many resistors were killed? The answer is simple. His name, his brother. Hermann Goering was too powerful, and Albert was family. The Nazi regime was brutal and efficient, but it also had internal politics. And Hermann Goering had enough power to protect his brother. The Nazis couldn't touch Albert without going through Hermann, and no one wanted to confront Hermann Goering. You didn't challenge Hermann Goering unless you wanted to end up dead. So Albert had a kind of shield, a protection. He was untouchable because of who his brother was. But Albert wasn't just safe because of his brother's power. He also understood the Nazi system. He understood how bureaucracy worked. He understood that the Nazis cared about paperwork. If the paperwork said something was authorized, then it was authorized. The Nazis were a regime of paperwork and order. They cared about following procedure. Everything had to be documented. Everything had to be in order, so Albert exploited that. He used their own system against them. He created paperwork. He forged documents. He issued travel permits that shouldn't have existed. And because the paperwork looked official, it worked. Because it had the right stamps and signatures, no one questioned it. The Nazi bureaucrats trusted the paperwork. They didn't think to question whether someone like Albert would actually betray the regime. Over the years of the war, from 1939 to 1945, Albert managed to help dozens of people escape. Some were Jewish, some were political prisoners, some were people who were just caught in the system. Intellectuals, artists, people who didn't fit into the Nazi worldview. But Albert helped them. He gave them visas. He gave them papers. He gave them information about how to get out. He helped them survive. He also did something remarkable. He used his position in the film industry to protect people. Albert was involved in film production. The Nazis were very interested in control through media. Film was propaganda. Film was how they shaped culture. So Albert worked in that industry, and he used his connections to get people jobs on film sets. If you had a job on a film set, you had a reason to travel. You had legitimate paperwork. You had cover. This was incredibly clever. It exploited the Nazi system's own bureaucratic nature against itself. The paperwork said this person was working on an important film production. Therefore, they were productive. They were contributing to the regime. They were useful. And they couldn't be arrested or deported because they had a job that was supporting the Nazi state. The system protected them because the system believed the paperwork. But Albert's activities became increasingly dangerous as the war went on. By 1943, the Nazis had become even more brutal. The killing was accelerating. The Holocaust was in full effect, and people were dying by the millions. The death camps were operating at full capacity. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The machines of death were working day and night. Albert couldn't save everyone. He knew he couldn't. But he kept trying anyway. The Gestapo, the secret police, were aware that there was sabotage happening in the bureaucracy. They knew that people were escaping who shouldn't have been able to escape. They knew that visas were being issued to people who shouldn't have received them. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know who was responsible. They suspected many people, but they couldn't quite catch anyone. They were looking for a spy, a traitor, but they never suspected that a Nazi officer, a man in uniform, a party member, would be the one helping people escape. There's a story that toward the end of the war, Albert was actually arrested by the Nazis. Not executed, not killed, but arrested. They suspected him. They had evidence, and they brought him in. And when he was released, he was told that Hermann had intervened. Hermann had used his power to get his brother released. Hermann, the Nazi leader, had saved his own brother from the Nazi system. Whether Hermann knew what Albert had been doing, or whether he just protected his brother out of family loyalty, history doesn't clearly say. But the protection was real. When the war ended in 1945, the Allies came in and took over. Germany was defeated. The regime was gone, and now the question was what to do with all the people who had been part of the Nazi system. War crimes tribunals were happening. Nazi officials were being arrested. Nazi leaders were being tried. Some were executed. Albert knew that his past association with the Nazi party could mean execution. The paperwork would show that he was a party member. The paperwork would show that he was an officer. The paperwork would show that he was part of the system. But Albert had something going for him. He had survivors. He had people whose lives he had saved. He had documentation of his activities. People came forward and testified about what Albert had done. They told the story of the Nazi officer who had saved them. They told the story of the man who had risked everything to help them escape. They gave testimony. They provided evidence. They vouched for him. The trials eventually cleared Albert. He wasn't executed. He wasn't imprisoned. He was recognized as someone who had worked against the Nazis from within. He was recognized as a resistor. Not a collaborator, a resistor. The court understood that while he had been part of the system, he had worked to undermine it. He had used his position to save lives rather than take them. After the war, Albert lived quietly. He didn't seek fame. He didn't write a book about his experiences. He didn't go on speaking tours telling people about what he'd done. He didn't try to profit from his story. He just lived his life in relative obscurity. He worked in the film industry again. He got married. He had a family. He lived until 1980. He died in Munich. He died in relative anonymity. Most people never knew his name. But here's what makes Albert's story remarkable. Here's what makes it different from other Nazi resistance stories. Albert wasn't a military officer secretly plotting to kill Hitler. He wasn't a diplomat passing intelligence to the Allies. He wasn't a famous resistor with an underground network. He wasn't leading an armed rebellion. He was just a man in the system who decided that the system was wrong. He was a man who used his position not to advance the Nazi ideology, but to oppose it. He was a man who understood that he had privilege. His family name, his access, his position in the bureaucracy, and he used that privilege to help people who didn't have any power at all. He was a man who confronted Nazi officers when they were cruel. He was a man who issued visas when he shouldn't have. He was a man who created false paperwork to help people escape. The real tragedy is that Albert's story has been largely forgotten. Most people who study the Holocaust know about the famous resistors. They know about Raoul Wallenberg. They know about Oskar Schindler. They know about the people who organized to fight the Nazis, but they don't know about Albert Goering. They don't know about the Nazi officer who saved Jews by handing out visas in secret. They don't know about a man who confronted his own system and paid a price for it, even if that price was less than others paid. Albert's story raises uncomfortable questions. It raises questions about complicity, about how much people knew, about how much people could have done, about how much people should have done. It raises questions about the nature of resistance, about whether you can resist from within, about whether you can be part of a system and still fight against it. And it raises questions about privilege. Albert had the privilege of his brother's power. He had the privilege of his name. He had the privilege of access to the bureaucracy, and he used that privilege to help other people. How many other Nazis had that same privilege and chose not to use it? How many other Nazis could have saved lives but chose not to? How many Nazi officers were in positions to help and simply looked away? After the war, Albert was asked why he did it, why he risked everything, why he put himself in danger, why he chose to help people who the regime wanted dead. And according to historical records, he said something simple. He said that what the Nazis were doing was wrong. He said that he couldn't stand by and watch it happen. He said that he had to do something, anything, even if it was just handing out visas and creating fake paperwork. He said that it was the right thing to do. It's a simple answer, but it's also a profound answer, because it suggests that Albert never accepted the Nazi ideology, never truly believed in it, never thought that the persecution of Jewish people was justified, never thought that extermination was acceptable. He went through the motions. He wore the uniform. He had the membership card, but he never believed it, and he used whatever power he had to resist it. He used whatever access he had to fight it. The real story of Albert Goering isn't a story of a Nazi hero. It's not a story of someone who overcame great odds and defeated evil. It's not a story of someone who single-handedly stopped the Holocaust or changed the war. It's a much smaller story. It's a story of a man who did what he could. It's a story of someone who used what little power he had to help people. It's a story of someone who chose to be decent when he could have been cruel. It's a story of someone who chose to save lives when he could have stood silent. And that's why it matters. Because it shows that even in the darkest system, even under the most brutal regime, even in Nazi Germany, there were people who found ways to resist. There were people who found ways to help. There were people who chose decency over ideology. There were people who chose humanity over party loyalty. Albert Goering was one of those people, and his story deserves to be remembered. Not as a famous story, not as a celebrated story, but as a quiet story about a man who did the right thing when it mattered most. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II that go beyond the propaganda, hit subscribe. New videos every week.